Hello everyone. Thank you for watching this video event online, the last of the RCRM Speakers Series, Season 1. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Georgiana Stanciu, Curator Executive Director at the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum, situated in Wellesley Barracks, London, Ontario. This will be the last video of the RCRM Speakers Series 2020, and for the season finale, we have invited Katrina Pasierbek, a doctoral candidate in history at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. Katrina has taught myth, memory, and public history at Laurier and King's University College at Western University. An educator both inside and outside the classroom, Katrina also leads overseas battlefield tours of First and Second World War sites in England, Belgium, and France. Before enrolling at Wilfrid Laurier, Katrina was our public programmer, and today she will be talking about a familiar feature to London's residents, the Cenotaph at Victoria Park. In the years following the First World War, Londoners raised local memorials to honor the generation who served in the war. Built in 1934, the most prominent local structure is the Cenotaph, located at Dufferin Avenue and Wellington Street. But few Londoners are aware of its complicated and intriguing history. Throughout its 86-year history, the Cenotaph has been edited to reflect Canada's military engagement in 20th and 21st centuries. The space surrounding the Cenotaph has become a gathering place for remembrance ceremonies, parades, public protests, and vandalism.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to hear the story behind London, Ontario's First World War Cenotaph. My sincere thanks to Dr. Georgiana Stanciu, Executive Director of the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum, and to Program Director Mark Vogelsang of the Ontario Institute of Audio Recording Technology for the opportunity to be a part of this speaker series. The 2020 Remembrance season has concluded in Canada, and like many public gatherings during the COVID-19 pandemic, annual Remembrance Day ceremonies across the country were not canceled, but reimagined in accordance with local health unit guidelines. The Royal Canadian Legion therefore requested that spectators not congregate in person this year, but to live stream a ceremony from the safety of their homes. A much smaller group of government officials gathered at the National War Memorial in Ottawa, spaciously standing in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier. The sidewalks in Canada's capital city are typically filled with thousands of spectators. This year, there were only a few. A little closer to home, Londoners saw similar restrictions put into place, with a small ceremony hosted by London's Remembrance Day Committee at the local Cenotaph, pictured here in the CTV News live stream of the event. Located at the southeast corner of Victoria Park, at the intersection of Wellington Street and Dufferin Avenue, local representatives, elected officials, veterans, and current members of the Canadian Armed Forces were invited to lay wreaths on behalf of the community, as the majority of Londoners observed 2 minutes of silence while watching from home. Even so, about 200 people still chose to witness the ceremony in person while socially distancing. A common theme that was present across Remembrance Day ceremonies was to ensure that community memorials remained at the center of the annual event. This was indeed true for Londoners, whose cenotaph has come to serve as a permanent and public reminder of a community's thanks for generations of Canadians who have gone to war throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries. However, the London Cenotaph has not always been the setting for locals to observe the solemn day. In fact, building a permanent local cenotaph took over a decade to complete and was unveiled 15 years after the First World War as an identical smaller replica of the cenotaph that stands in London, England. But before we can discuss how Londoners commemorated the war, we must begin with a brief overview of Canada during the First World War. In 1914, after a tumultuous summer of European events, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and set European powers on a trajectory for war. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd and made the mistake of attempting to invade France by marching German troops through Belgium. But Belgium was a neutral country, and Britain, as an ally, came to Belgium's defense by presenting Germany with an ultimatum: withdraw invading troops, or else Britain and her empire will come to the aid of Belgium. But the deadline for a response passed, and Germany's silence was all that Britain needed to hear. On the 4th of August in 1914, the British Empire was at war with Germany. In 1914, Canada was a self-governing dominion with a population of approximately 8 million people. London, Ontario was a city of 55,000 people. Canadian international affairs were determined in British Parliament. And so, on the 4th of August, Canadian officials were informed that the Dominion was automatically at war alongside Britain. Based on the short lengths of previous European wars, Canadians believed that this new outbreak of war would last no more than 4 or 5 months at the most. But this war would wage on for over 4 years and require wartime governments to mobilize their populations in unprecedented ways. While existing regiments were called up, including the locally raised Royal Canadian Regiment, most of the individuals who composed the Canadian Expeditionary Force were volunteer citizens. Canada's soldiers, some of whom are pictured here, were local clerks, city bankers, farmers, young teenagers, nurses, and doctors, many enlisting at their local recruitment center with little or no previous military experience. After over 4 years of fighting, over 61,000 Canadian deaths, and thousands more wounded, An armistice was scheduled to take effect at 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918. This was not a formal surrender, but an agreement that fighting would simply be paused for a period of time. The official end of the war would come 7 months later with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. While news of the armistice was met with celebrations in the streets, it was a somber occasion for Londoners who were grieving the loss of a loved one. Retired Captain Ray Fleming of the Royal Canadian Regiment and I created this map in 2016 to better understand how military deaths were reflected in the city's neighborhoods. To help give us some bearings, the top red star indicates Western University's campus. To the right is the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum at Wolseley Barracks. And the third red star indicates the location of the forks of the Thames. Every yellow marker indicates the address of where a deceased soldier's family lived during the wartime years. Some London families lost 2 sons, including the Garrett family, who lived at 47 Hale Street, and the Raymond family at 16 Cove Road. These addresses are just the ones we were able to mark. Undoubtedly, there are others. As the bodies of deceased soldiers were buried close to their place of death on the battlefield, families were not given the opportunity to bury the body of their loved one or to have a grave nearby to visit. This motivated communities across combatant countries to construct war memorials to honor their fallen that came in different shapes, sizes, uses, and designs. Just a quick word on some important definitions. A monument is a structure that is often built to celebrate a notable individual, whereas a memorial is a structure to honor the memory of an individual or an event. And before we can discuss London, Ontario's War Memorial, we must first look to London, England, to learn how their national memorial came to be. In July 1919, British Prime Minister Lloyd George approached architect Edwin Lutyens to design a temporary catafalque for the upcoming Peace Day parade scheduled for Saturday, July 19. With less than 10 days before the parade, Lutyens suggested a cenotaph was more appropriate for the occasion, and put pencil to paper to produce these rough sketches of a design. 10 days later, a 35-foot high temporary cenotaph constructed of timber and plaster was placed in the middle of the street on Whitehall, a short walk away from the Houses of Parliament in the capital city of London, England. A cenotaph literally means empty tomb and stands to represent the memory of the dead who are buried in another location. And Lutyens' design includes an empty sarcophagus on the very top. The simplicity and striking presence of the design was celebrated by all in attendance at the Saturday parade, some of whom are pictured here. By the end of July, it was decided that a permanent version of the cenotaph would replace the temporary structure. On November 11th, 1920, the permanent cenotaph was unveiled from beneath two Union Jack flags by His Royal Highness George V, pictured here. The solemn ceremony took place in the presence of the casket containing the body of the unknown warrior, a member of the British forces who was unidentified at the time of burial. Exhumed from a military cemetery from the front lines of war, this body represents all of Britain's war dead and was bestowed with full military honors, a funeral procession through the streets of London, and was buried among kings in Westminster Abbey later that same day. The 6 military flags, called ensigns, that were flown on either side of the cenotaph from 1920 to 1921 were taken down and distributed throughout the British Empire to reinforce the deep connection that Britain shared with the dominions who had sacrificed so much for king and empire. The naval British ensign was gifted to Ottawa. And now that we will turn our attention to Canada's London, this will be an important detail that I will address a little later on. While the cenotaph in England was immediately recognized as the centerpiece of remembrance in Britain, in Canada's London, locals initially thought that a practical memorial building was the most appropriate way to honor the war dead. And so, in October 1922, the War Memorial Children's Hospital was opened on Colborne and South Streets. But almost as soon as it was opened, mixed opinions debated whether it was enough. A London Free Press article wrote that, quote, "We feel that hospitals and halls, indispensable as they are for the living, are inadequate as a memorial for the dead," end quote. The discussion for a permanent war memorial for London, Ontario had been sparked. Today, what remains of the War Memorial Children's Hospital is pictured here, awaiting purchase and most likely demolition to make way for a new residential neighborhood. The municipal chapter of the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire, commonly referred to as the IODE, stepped up in April 1925 to initiate the push for a local memorial to be built. And they were an ideal organization to see this project through, as the IODE had already successfully raised money to support the War Memorial Children's Hospital and erected London's South African War Memorial in Victoria Park, pictured here. Having been inspired by the cenotaph in England, the IODE proposed that the cenotaph standing in the heart of the empire in England be replicated and built in their corner of Canada. By February 1926, the IODE raised $4,000 for the project and successfully requested that London City Council match their funds through a municipal grant. The next logical question was location. Streetcar rails in the streets, public parks, and a space large enough to allow crowds to gather were all taken into consideration when determining the placement of the city's cenotaph. This composite photograph offers a glimpse into how city planners creatively visualized various locations in the city where the cenotaph could be constructed. The photographer is standing in the intersection of Wellington and Dundas Streets, facing north towards Victoria Park. A second photograph of Britain's cenotaph was cut out and pasted onto the photograph of the streets in Canada's London. Because if the original cenotaph was constructed in the middle of a street, Londoners had to consider a similar location for their own cenotaph. The IODE preferred the intersection at Richmond Street and Central Avenue, nearby where the Williams and Starbucks are located today. But during the 1920s, it was a unique intersection where the three streets of Richmond, Central, and Clarence all intersected. In March 1929, the Cenotaph Committee reported to City Council that this was the location that was the top contender. But within a few short months, plans would be immediately halted. In October 1929, the stock market crashed worldwide, and the Great Depression swept financial uncertainty and unemployment across Canada. Like many ongoing First World War memorial projects, London Cenotaph was paused until a more appropriate financial time. And so Londoners carried on into the 1930s with no permanent war memorial for the city's war dead. But I argue that this was not a pressing issue for several reasons. The generation who had lived and fought during the war had, during the 11 years since the armistice, established their own annual Armistice Day rituals that were community-based and not citywide. An annual military parade would begin at the armories and arrive at St. Paul's Cathedral on Richmond Street for an afternoon memorial service. Individual congregations across the city honored members of their own church communities with honor rolls listing the names of those who had served and those who had died. Window displays by local businesses along Richmond and Dundas Streets were decorated with Union Jack flags and featured photographs of overseas war cemeteries where local soldiers were buried. A selection of advertisements in the newspaper from local businesses were all printed with a poppy, urging Londoners to contribute to the annual poppy campaign. The Armistice Day services of the 1920s had a very different tone indeed, and did not require a cenotaph. Remembrance across Canada would change in 1931, when the federal government declared November 11th a national holiday through legislation. Armistice Day was to be renamed Remembrance Day and marked every November 11th, regardless of the day of the week it fell on. This change also prompted the move of Thanksgiving from November to October to ensure that Thanksgiving and Remembrance Day would no longer fall on the same day, which had angered some veterans for quite some time. London's veterans announced that to honor Canada's first Remembrance Day, they would take it upon themselves to recreate the annual service that unfolds at Britain's Cenotaph. But one key piece was missing: a local cenotaph of their own. Equipped with Edwin Lutyens' original architectural plans, Canadian veterans constructed a replica cenotaph much smaller in scale than the 35-foot-tall original, and our smaller scale replica stood in the middle of Dundas Street in front of the then location of London City Hall. On Wednesday, November 11th, businesses were closed, classes were canceled, and at 11 o'clock in the morning, a gun salute in Victoria Park commenced a moment of silence. Perhaps it was the glimmer at the end of the Great Depression, or perhaps it was the presence of the temporary cenotaph in 1931. But by October 1933, the London, Ontario Cenotaph project was revived. The smaller scale replica of Britain's cenotaph would stand at 17 feet in height in London, Ontario, and be composed of limestone from the Queenston quarries in Niagara Falls. And after much debate about the location, the southeast corner of Victoria Park was decided upon during the summer of 1934. Construction began in September, and the cenotaph was ready for its official unveiling on Saturday, November 10th, 1934. The ceremony began with the arrival of a veterans parade to Victoria Park. The cenotaph, pictured here, had been draped with 2 Union Jack flags to replicate the unveiling of the original cenotaph in England. Joan de Weiler, regent of the municipal chapter of the IODE, released the flags during the ceremony, formally unveiling the cenotaph to the 4,000 people gathered to witness the historic event. The Union Jacks, as they fell, revealed in the center of the 3 flags fastened to the south side of the cenotaph a stained and weather-beaten white British naval ensign, the same one that had once flown on the original cenotaph in London, England. The inclusion of this flag further reinforced the deep connection that the cenotaph in Canada's London shared with the cenotaph in England. The ensign stayed up until 5 o'clock in the afternoon on November 11th, when it was removed during a short ceremony at sundown and returned to Ottawa. The cenotaph, while originally raised to commemorate the fallen of the First World War, would continue to be modified to reflect Canada's wars of the 20th century. Following the end of the Second World War in 1945, the cenotaph in England added the dates 1939 to 1945 in Roman numerals so that it would honor both world wars. And it was quite common for communities to simply add an inscription to an existing First World War memorial to honor the fallen of the Second. And London, Ontario was no exception. In 1946, Mayor Fred McAllister followed the lead of the original cenotaph and requested that the exact diagram of the inscription be sent from Britain, quote, so that the duplication of the cenotaphs would be maintained, end quote. 2 years later, the dates 1939 to 1945 were added to the cenotaph in Victoria Park, which would now serve as a memorial to honor both world wars. As time carried on, national and social changes in Canada during the second half of the 20th century came to impact the local cenotaph. In February 1965, Canada's new maple leaf flag officially replaced the Canadian red ensign as the national flag. But could it, and would it, ever be flown on the cenotaph in London, Ontario? London Mayor Gordon Stronach was one of the fiercest opponents of the newly unveiled flag to be included in local remembrance services. Stronach argued that since the cenotaph is a memorial to war dead, it would be inappropriate to fly a flag that Canadian troops did not serve under. Furthermore, the mayor said that since our cenotaph is modeled after the one in England, the cenotaphs must continue to fly the same flags, which would exclude the maple leaf. But as the red ensign was phased out of public display, the few that remained quickly transformed into collector's items and the prized possessions of thieves. In May 1966, after many flag thefts, City Council decided enough is enough and removed all flags from the cenotaph, and they would only be raised during Remembrance Day services. The red maple leaf flag, of course, was eventually added to the flagpoles during Remembrance Day. But with many First World War veterans passing away in their older age, and with the memory of the Second World War in the past, remembrance in Canada during the 1970s and 1980s was not on the minds of many Canadians, except on the 11th of November. But one controversial incident that occurred in London would impact the way in which the space surrounding London's cenotaph would be defined for future generations. In 1983, prior to these protective barriers, a sidewalk vendor set up along the edge of the base of the cenotaph in Victoria Park. This use of the space was interpreted by some as being disrespectful of a site that was intended to honor Canada's fallen soldiers, and quickly escalated into a contested public debate about freedom of speech and assembly and what was referred to in the media as the Battle of the Cenotaph. Veterans groups took this opportunity to request that City Council pass a bylaw to limit the use of the cenotaph and surrounding area from disrespectful uses, which included banning groups protesting such causes as nuclear disarmament and world peace. This request angered anti-war groups, since they argued their gatherings in the shadow of the cenotaph had always been respectful of the war dead. In December, by a vote of 11-8, council members voted no for a cenotaph bylaw. While they took into considerations the concerns of veterans to protect the space from misuse, they concluded that a bylaw would infringe on the individual rights of assembly. Outraged veterans threatened to boycott future Remembrance Day ceremonies if steps were not taken to limit the public use of the cenotaph and the space surrounding it. In fact, after surveying the site, some veteran groups threatened to remove the cenotaph from its location to the grounds of Parkwood Hospital, where veterans could keep a protective eye on it. In May 1984, veterans found a solution. They abandoned their support for a bylaw and instead pressed council for a resolution. A bylaw requires enforcement, whereas a resolution reflects community standards. Under the proposed resolution, the cenotaph would be used to honor Canadian and Allied war dead and those who died in the cause of freedom. The Battle of the Cenotaph concluded with the raising of this plaque, which reads, quote, "This cenotaph is reserved for memorial services to honor Canada's war dead, those of Canada's allies, and those who died in the cause of freedom." Permission to use the cenotaph for these purposes, consistent with the symbolism represented by it, may be obtained from the municipality. In the first 6 months after this requirement was put in place, 11 groups applied to use the cenotaph, none of whom were rejected. With the passage of time, the physical structure of the cenotaph had begun to show signs of deterioration, and the 80-year-old structure was dubbed the crumbling cenotaph by local media. In addition to the natural wear and tear on the exterior face, the supports within the hollow interior required a bit of restoration work. In addition to structural repair, officials also recognized that this would be the ideal opportunity to update the cenotaph with Canada's more recent military engagements. While the dates 1950 to 1953 for the Korean War had already been inscribed on the south-facing wall, the word Korea was added, peacekeeping missions were added, and an inscription for the war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014 was added. This restoration project cost just under $500,000. But once the scaffolding was removed from around the cenotaph, an error was quickly spotted on the south-facing wall. The Afghanistan dates were incorrectly inscribed as having begun in 2010 and not 2001. A London Free Press article published in August 2017 opened with the headline, "Spelling Afghanistan correctly was the worry, the dates weren't so much a concern." As it is difficult to erase an error carved into a cenotaph, a piece of the block was immediately removed so that the correct date would be displayed. And so we have our cenotaph. Very few Canadians today realize that the cenotaph standing in Victoria Park has a deeply symbolic connection with the cenotaph in England. I think that is because over the past 80 years, our cenotaph has taken on a distinctly Canadian tone that reflects Canada as an independent nation. Our country can go to war on our own accord and not because Britain does first. Our military serves under our own national flag, which flies proudly on our local cenotaph. And Londoners have created a culturally defined space in the corner of Victoria Park that continues to be at the center of Remembrance Day commemorations. Whether watching from home or in person, the cenotaph has evolved into the center of remembrance activities and rituals for the City of London, Ontario, and will undoubtedly continue to serve the community for years to come. Thank you for listening.
Katrina, thank you so much for this detailed and electrifying history of a spot that has a special place in Londoners' heart. Before closing, I just wish to say that it has been my pleasure and privilege to organize the RCRM Speakers Series and to work with each and every one of the speakers. Intended as an on-site, once-a-month public event, the program was disrupted in March 2020 with the restrictions imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Nevertheless, we adjusted to an online format streamed via the museum's YouTube channel. Many thanks to all speakers for their flexibility, for their adaptability, and willingness to learn new video recording skills. The museum wishes to also extend a bunch of gratitude to the sound director, Mark Vogelsang, who has dedicated much of his time to create the podcast episodes of the series. And by the way, the podcast is available to download on Simplecast, on iTunes, or Spotify free of charge. And finally, the RCRM Speaker Series will continue in 2021 with a second season. The theme is Economy of Loss, and we will explore various aspects of loss in the context of military conflict. Complex facets of the dynamic between mourning and commemoration, deprivation and rejection, or disposal of war byproducts will surface with undeniable traces on the communities found in the path of the clash. The second season of the RCRM Speaker Series will start on 21st of January 2021 with Professor Gordon Heath, who will present the trauma of war and the rise of religious pacifism in the interwar years, 1919-1939. Until then, allow me to again say thank you for your loyalty, and that we hope you will continue to watch our RCRM Speaker Series.